gender. Is a gender identity real? Well, first of all, it depends on what you mean by real. It's not real the way the gender identity ideologues insist, because they are very bad psychometricians. They have no idea in their idiot disciplines how to measure the phenomena that they claim exist. Now, having said that, obviously there are important functional differences between men and women, the most important of which, you might say, is the fact that if you take the typical man and the typical women and they engage in sexual activity, there is some reasonable probability that a child will emerge. And so that's a fundamental reality of life. And it takes that binary process to produce the manifestation of that new life. And so that's where the rubber really hits the road. Now, there are markers for that. Of course, men and women have different chromosomal structures and all sorts of different biological attributes, although there's a fair bit of overlap in the human form, and you can tell that because that's how you know we're human. And so, now on top of that, imagine there's biological sex as it's embodied. But then on top of that, there's the flexibility that comes with the fact that human beings are flexible actors, perceptually and conceptually, and that we're also creatures that undergo a very lengthy period of education, of socialization. Much of our brain is not programmed with deterministic instinct at birth. It has to mature in a social context. And the direction in which that maturation takes place is dependent to some degree on the social surround, but it's also to some degree dependent on other biological factors that are somewhat loosely linked to sex, but that vary more. And so we know that personality, for example, has something approximating a 5-dimensional structure. Now, you can differentiate that into 10 aspects. You get a little bit higher resolution that way and a little bit more descriptive accuracy. And there's some debate about whether it should be 5 or 6. And that depends to some degree on how you lay out the statistics. But no one disagrees that there are something approximating 5 basic dimensions of temperament. And those temperament might be regarded as characteristic ways of perceiving and acting in the world. So extroversion, that's propensity for positive emotion. Neuroticism, that's propensity for negative emotion. Agreeableness is something like the maternal dimension. It's politeness and compassion. It's the proclivity to sacrifice yourself for others. That might be a good way of thinking about it. Conscientiousness, that's dutifulness, orderliness, industriousness, and openness, which is the creativity domain and the domain of interest in ideas. 5 dimensions of variability. And that's on top of the binary biological platform. Now, there's a link because men and women tend to have their own sex-typed temperaments. So women are, on average, higher in negative emotion and higher in agreeableness. And then there are minor distinctions with the rest of the traits, which I won't go into now because they're much smaller. But on average, women are more agreeable. They're more self-sacrificing in relationship to others, which goes along with their propensity to care for infants, because you have to do that when you care for infants. And they're more threat and negative emotion sensitive. And that might be because, well, you could argue that the world is actually objectively more dangerous for women because they're vulnerable on the sexual front and because they're smaller physically, but also that the world needs to be reacted to some degree as if it's a more threatening place because women are charged with the primary care of infants, and infants are very vulnerable. So you could say you have binary sex for all functional purposes. Obviously, for all functional purposes, because you need a man and a woman or their biological equivalents to produce a new baby, which, as I said, is where the rubber hits the road. And then on top of that, you have variation in temperament in 5 dimensions that's somewhat sex-typed. Now, it gets complicated because although men and women on average have different personalities, they also, by the way, have on average difference in interest. So women are reliably more interested in people and men are reliably more interested in things That's cross-culturally valid, and that's the biggest difference we know of between men and women. So that's another dimension of variability, although it's associated with temperamental differences. So agreeable people tend to be more interested in people. In any case, there's enough variability within that 5-dimensional space, so there are no shortage of more masculine women and more feminine men. And so that doesn't mean that they're not binary in their fundamental biological function or their cellular identity or a multitude of markers at the physiological level, which we could detail, but which I would believe are painfully obvious to everyone. And so now if gender is something like temperamental variability, then it exists. If it isn't temperamental variability, I don't know what the hell it is. And the gender theorists, who are fuzzy thinkers beyond compare, don't ever try to nail down their concepts to something approximating multi-trait, multi-method measurement, which is, okay, if you're talking about gender, what do you mean? Well, what do you mean? What do you mean? I mean, how do you know it exists? What are the techniques of assessment, detection, that you utilize technically to specify the target of your claim? What is gender? Well, it's what people feel they are. It's like, yeah, that's your theory, eh? That's a stupid theory. It's not going anywhere, that theory. And so that's just a theory that enables you to claim something like the primacy of your narcissistic whim. It has nothing to do with the careful delineation of what actually constitutes identity. And so it's complex because there is variability in masculinity and femininity on top of the binary biological substructure. And so that also means that you have to have a certain amount of tolerance for role variability. And you should, because there are masculine women and there are feminine men. And it's harder for them in some real sense to adopt the role that would be easily commensurate with their biological identity because they share many features, temperamental features that are characteristic of the opposite sex. But that doesn't mean that they're born in the wrong body. One question there would be, well, what exactly is it that's born in the wrong body? Is it some sort of soul? I mean, people who make these claims are generally not on the side of the people who claim the existence of the soul. So what the hell is it exactly that's born in the wrong body? The person's core identity, the person's true self. It's like, yeah, that's all hand-waving. I have no idea what you mean by that, except unless it's part of a context-dependent story where we more or less agree on the terms. But to abstract them out and say, well, that's not the person's real core self. It's like, sorry, man, you've wandered into uncharted territory there. First of all, you think you know what constitutes people's core self. It's like, really? You really know that, do you? Yeah, well, I don't think so. And then you could even take another radical claim and say, well, there's an infinite number of gender identities. It's like, yeah, if you want to play it that way, that's true. Because the amount of variability in a 5-dimensional space it's unbelievably large. You could say with no reason to be contradicted that every single person on the planet in some sense has a unique gender identity if you associate gender with temperament, because every person is unique in their particular constellation of personality. And so if you want to conflate those two things, then you can. It starts to become very problematic when you additionally conflate them with sex. It's like, well, sex and gender and temperament, they're all the same thing. It's like, well, actually they're not. And the reason they're not is because, to say it again, you need a man and a woman to produce a child. And so you might ask, well, what's a man and what's a woman? And one thing you can say is, well, a man is half of what it takes to produce a child, and the woman is the other half. And there's nothing about that that's merely subjectively defined. And it really is where the conceptual structure, whatever that is, the temperamental structure, and then the way we view that temperamental structure, the rubber still has to hit the road in the reproductive sphere. And you might say, well, we don't need any of that messy reproduction because there's too many people on the bloody planet anyways, or something like that. But that doesn't First of all, that just unmoors you, and I wouldn't recommend that because you might think that having an indeterminate identity frees you, and all it does is produce so much chaos in your life that you're not going to be able to tolerate it. No one else is going to know what to do with you. And this is one of the things that made me object to compelled speech on the pronoun front when the laws first started to emerge in Canada. It's like the trans activists would come up to me and say, well, you know, you're really hurting me if you don't accept my indeterminacy of identity. And I thought, well, that's what you think, but as a trained clinician, I think that I'm going to do you a lot more damage in the medium to long run by going along with your claim that you can just be anything you want moment to moment. You think that's freeing because you regard all social constraints as inhibitions on the wonderful manifestation of your true self. But I know that in order to be healthy in the long run, you have to be integrated at multiple levels of social community. And when you introduce indeterminacy as to your status at the sex level, no one has any idea what to do with you. And so how are they going to play with you? They don't know what you are in some sense that even enables the ball game to get off the ground. And so that's no recipe for long-term well-being, because that's always bandied about, that notion of well-being and harm. It's like, no, you have to negotiate an identity, regardless of your temperamental variability. You have to negotiate an identity that allows other people to get a handle on you in some sense. It's like, well, what are you? Well, I don't know. It's like, well, then I'm going to go find someone else to talk to, because if you're so confused that you can't even stabilize your identity moment to moment, I don't even know who I'm talking to. And why would I do that? It's too complicated. You're too much drama. You're too much trouble. You know, and so many of the people who find themselves in that situation where they're making these preposterous identity claims are, in fact, people who are that much trouble. And the reason they're so confused is because they don't have any friends. And part of the reason they don't have any friends is because they insist that it's their way or the highway. And that's no way to make friends. And it's no pathway to sanity. Quite the contrary. And all these clinicians who are bandying about their moral virtue with regard to their gender-affirming care, which is preposterous on the ethical front, as I already said, because someone's subjective feelings are not an unerring marker of their identity, period, the end, as all of the ethical guidelines of psychologists have already indicated for like 50 years. You're just enticing them down a road that's not going to be useful. Why would you allow, or why would you affirm someone's choice of a game that makes them impossible to play with? Now, as a psychologist, you're not in the game to affirm or contest someone's identity. What you are in the game of is helping them negotiate an identity in the therapeutic context that will generalize outside the therapeutic context, obviously, because what good is it otherwise? And that means that the identity negotiated within the therapeutic context has to be a game that can be playable across multiple situations. And that sets serious constraints on what that identity is going to be. So, for example, if you never listen, then you're not going to be playing a very successful game. If you can't take turns, no one's going to play with you. If you don't keep your word, people might play one game with you, but they won't play many. And so if you're not reciprocal in your interaction, so that if you receive, you also give, and maybe even give a bit more, then no one's going to be able to interact with you. And these are not arbitrary rules. They're principles of iterated social interaction at multiple levels of hierarchy simultaneously, tightly constrained. And you can think about it this way. You're a player in a basketball team in a league. Okay, so what are you doing when you're playing the game? Well, you're trying to attain the aim. The more basketballs through the hoop, the better. You're trying to do that in a way that helps all the other members of your team do that too. Then you're trying to do that in a way that abides by the principles that make the game possible. That's the following of the rules. Then you're doing it in a way that may also lead to the development of the skill of the people on the opposing team, because you want your teams to be appropriately matched, because otherwise the game isn't any fun. And so you might say, well, what's the point of the competition. And you might say to defeat the other team. And that's a very local point. But the more compelling point is that both teams are playing so that both teams become more skillful. And that's a superordinate ethic of the game. And then, so now your behavior is constrained by the necessity of being a good teammate, and then your team's behavior is constrained by the necessity of abiding by the principles of fair competition and the rules of the game. And then the game isn't just the game because you're playing a sequence of games because you're in a league, and so you have to play the game so that your skill improves over the games and so that other teams want to play with you and want to play fairly with you so you can't cheat because the next time you meet them, they're going to take revenge for your cheating. And then you have to play by the rules of fair play so that your teammates like you, so that your opponents admire you or respect you or both, so that the crowd is pleased with the manner in which you conduct yourself, and so that improves across time. And so that's extraordinarily constrained. Your identity as a basketball player is extraordinarily constrained. And even if you're the most skillful player on the team, if it's all about you, then your technical skill, the mismatch between your technical skill and your game ethic is going to doom you to failure over any reasonable period of time, even if you're extremely skillful. Now, obviously, the best player is going to be someone who's extremely skillful and who has a very high standard of iterated game ethic. That's the optimal player. And you can say that about every single game. And then if you think about that, you can understand how sanity has to be nested inside a social community, because it's the regulation of the individual, the integrated regulation of the individual in relationship to these superordinate structures that, as I said before, in some sense defines sanity itself, at least of the desirable kind. And it's appalling for therapists to abandon that conception in the favor of something like a subjectively defined identity of whim. It's an absolute and utter unethical abdication of every element of professional responsibility. And the same thing goes for the physicians who are wandering down this idiot pathway just as quickly. There is no excuse for it. So there's no conceptual excuse for it. There's no ethical excuse for it. And fear of the mob doesn't justify it either.